A Bar of Shadow by Sir Lawrence Vander Post. As we walked across the fields, we hardly spoke. I myself no longer had the heart to try and make conversation. I looked forward so eagerly to this Christmas visit of John Lawrence, and yet, now that he was here, we seemed incapable of talking to each other in a real way. I hadn't seen him for 5 years, not since we said goodbye at our prison gates on release at the end of the war. I to return to my civilian life, he to go straight back to the army on active service. Until then, for years, he and I had walked, as it were, hand in hand with the danger of war, and endured the same bitter things at the hand of the Japanese in prison. Indeed, when our release came, we found that our experience, shared in the embattled world about us, fitted like a measured garment to the great and instinctive coincidence of affection we felt for each other. That moment of rounded nearness had stayed with me. There was no separation in it for me, no distance of purple leagues between him and me. I knew only too well the cruel and unnecessary alliance, unnecessary because either one of them is powerful enough, that time and distance contract for waging their war against our brief and brittle human nearnesses. But if I had managed to stay close, why should he have been set so far apart? For that is precisely what I felt, although he was so near to me that I had but to half stretch out a hand to take his arm. Never in 5 years of separation had he seemed so far away as now. I stole a quick glimpse of him. The suit of pre-war tweeds, which still fitted him perfectly, sat on his tall, broad frame more like service uniform than becoming country garments, and he was walking like a somnambulist at my side, with an odd unconscious deliberation and purposefulness, a strange tranced expression on his face. His large gray eyes, set well apart under that fine and wide brow and a noble head, were blue with the distance between us. Even the light of that contracting December afternoon, receding from the day like the gray tide of a stilled sea from a forgotten and forlorn foreshore, fuming silently in the gathering mists of time, glowed in his eyes not like a light from without so much as the fading tones of a frozen wintry moment far back in some calendar of his own within. Their focus clearly was not that of that moment and that place, and the irony of it was almost more than I could bear without protest. I don't know what I would have done if something unknown within me, infinitely wiser and more knowledgeable than my conscious self marching at his side in bitter judgment over this resumption, that was not a resumption of our relationship, had not suddenly swept into command and ordered me to ask, "You have not by any chance run into Ratang Hara again?" The question was out before I even knew I was going to ask it, and instantly I felt a fool at having put it. So irrelevant and remote from that moment did it seem. But to my amazement, he stopped short in his tracks, turned to me, and, like someone released from an emotion too tight for him, said with obvious relief, "It is curious you asked me that, for I was thinking of him just then." He paused slightly, and then added with an apologetic laugh, as if he feared being misunderstood, "I've been thinking of him all day. I can't get him out of my head." My relief matched his, for instantly I recognized a contact that could bridge his isolation. Here was a preoccupation I could understand and follow a long way, even if I could not share it to the end. Just the thought of Hara and the mention of his name was enough to bring the living image of the man as clearly to my senses as if I had only just left him, and as if at any moment, now behind me, that strange, strangled, nerve-taut solar plexus voice of his, which exploded in him when he was enraged, would shriek, "Kra!" The rudest of the many rude ways in Japanese of saying, "Come here, you!" At the thought, the hair on the back of my neck suddenly became sensitive to the cold air, and suddenly I looked over my shoulder as if I really expected to see him standing at the gates of the long barn, beckoning us with an imperious arm stretched out straight in front of him, and one impatient hand beating the air like the wings of a large yellow butterfly in its last desperate flutter before metamorphosis into a creeping and crawling thing on earth. But the field behind us, of course, was empty, and the great gray peace of winter, the tranquil and tranced benediction of a rest well earned by eager earth, long wooed and well beloved by man, lay over the tired and sleeping land. The scene indeed, in that gently shrinking moment of daylight, stood over itself, as if it were an inner dream in the inmost sleep of itself, as if circumstances had contrived to make it conform absolutely to that vision which had made England a blessed thought of heaven on earth to us when we were in prison under Hara. And a rush of bitterness, rudely brushing aside the relief I had felt, went straight to my heart that Hara's twisted, contorted shape should still be able to walk this intimate and healing scene with us. I said in prison under Hara, for though he was not the commandant, he was by far the greatest of the powers that ruled our prison world. He himself was only a third-class sergeant in his Imperial Japanese Majesty's forces, and nominally we had a young subaltern in charge, but that slight young man more resembled an elegant character out of the novels of the great Murasaki, or the pillow book of her hated rival, than a 20th century samurai. We seldom saw him, and his interest in us seemed focused only on the extent to which we could add in variety and number to his collection of wristwatches. John Lawrence, who had once been assistant military attaché in Tokyo, said he was certain our commandant was not born in the great hereditary military classes of Japan, but was probably a second-class customs officer from Kobe or Yokohama, who could therefore not be dishonored as a real soldier and would have been an ignominious appointment to command a camp of despised prisoners of war. But Hara, he said, was the real thing, not of the officer class, but the authentic feudal follower, unhesitatingly accompanying his master and overlords into battle. He had served his masters long and well, had fought in Korea, Manchuria, China, and this unexacting job now, presumably, was his reward. I don't know how right Lawrence was, but one thing stood out. Hara had no inferiority complex about his officer. One had only to see them together to realize which was authentic, predestined military material, and which merely deriving color and benefit from war. Scrupulously correct as Hara was in his outward behavior to his officer, we had no doubt that inwardly he felt superior. He never hesitated to take command of a situation when he thought it necessary. I have seen him on inspections walk rudely in between the commandant and our ranks, haul out someone who would unwittingly transgress his mysterious code of what was due on these occasions, and in a kind of semi-conscious epilepsy of fury, beat the poor fellow nearly to death with anything that came to hand, while his disconcerted officer took himself and his refined custom-house senses off to a more tranquil part of the parade ground. No! Not he, but Hara ruled us with a cold, predetermined, carefully conditioned, and archaic will of steel, as tough as the metal in the large two-handed sword of his ancestors, dangling on his incongruous prehistoric hip. It was he, Hara, who decided how much, or rather how little, we had to eat. He ordained when we were driven to bed, when we got up, where and how we paraded, what we read. It was he who ordered that every book, among the few we possessed, wherein the word kiss or the mention of kissing appeared, should be censored by having the offending pages torn out and publicly burned as an offense against Japanese morality. It was he who tried to purify our thinking by making us, in our desperately undernourished condition, go without food for 2 days at a time, confined in cramped and overcrowded cells, forbidden even to talk so that we could contemplate all the better our perverse and impure European navels. It was he who beat me because a row of beans that he had made my men plant had not come up, and he who put the failure down to my wrong thinking. It was he who, when drunk, would babble to me endlessly about Greta Garbo and Marlene Dietrich, whose faces haunted him. He who questioned me for hours about the Knights of the Round Table, 606, Salvarsan, and the latest drugs for curing syphilis. He mounted and controlled our brutal Korean guards, gave them their orders, and made them fanatical converts, more zealous than their only prophet, to his outlook and mood. He made our laws, judged us for offenses against them, punished us, and even killed us for breaking them. He was indeed a terrible little man, not only in the way that the great Tartar Ivan was terrible, but also in a peculiarly racial and demonic way. He possessed the sort of terribleness that thousands of years of littleness might seek to inflict on life as both a revenge and a compensation of having been so little for so long. He had an envy of tallness and stature, which had turned to an implacable hatred of both. And when his demon, an ancient, insatiable, and irresistibly compelled aspect of himself that lived somewhere far down within him, with a great yellow autonomy and will of its own, stirred in him, I have seen him beat up the tallest among us for no other reason than save that they were so much taller than he. Even his physical appearance was both a rejection and a form of vengeance on normality, a vaudeville magnification and a caricature of the Japanese male figure. He was so short that he just missed being a dwarf, so broad that he was almost square. He hardly had any neck, and his head, which had no back to it, sat almost straight on his broad shoulders. The hair on his head was thick and of a midnight blue. It was extremely coarse and harsh in texture, and, cut short, stood stark and stiff like the bristles on a boar's back straight up in the air. His arms were exceptionally long and seemed to hang to his knees, but his legs, by contrast, were short, extremely thick, and so bowed that the sailors with us called them old cutlass legs. His mouth was filled with big, faded yellow teeth, elaborately framed in gold, while his face tended to be square, and his forehead rather low and simian. Yet he possessed a pair of extraordinarily fine eyes that seemed to have nothing to do with the rest of his features and appearance. They were exceptionally wide and large for a Japanese, and with the light and polish and warm, living, luminous quality of the finest Chinese jade in them. It was extraordinary how far they went to redeem this terrible little man from caricature. One looked into his eyes, and all desire to mock vanished. For then one realized that this twisted being was, in some manner beyond European comprehension, a dedicated and utterly selfless person. It was John Lawrence who suffered more at Hara's hands than any of us except those whom he killed, who first drew our attention to his eyes. I remember so clearly his words one day after a terrible beating in prison. "The thing you mustn't forget about Hara," he had said, "is that he is not an individual, or for that matter even really a man." He had gone on to say that Hara was the living myth, the expression in human form, the personification of the inner intense vision, which far down in their unconscious keeps the Japanese people together and shapes and compels their thinking and behavior. We should not forget 2,700 full cycles of his sun goddess's rule burnt in him. He was sure no one could be more faithful and responsive to all the imperceptible murmurings of Japan's archaic and submerged racial soul than he. Hara was humble enough to accept implicitly the promptings of his national spirit. He was a simple and educated country lad with primitive integrity unassailed by higher education, and really believed all the myths and legends of the past so deeply that he did not hesitate to kill for them. Only the day before he had told Lawrence how in Manchuria the sun goddess had once lifted a train full of soldiers over an undetected Chinese mine laid for them on the track, and put them all down again safely on the other side. "But just look in his eyes," Lawrence had said. "There is nothing ignoble or insincere there, only an ancient light, refueled, quickened, and quietly burning. There is something about the fellow I rather like and respect." The last sentence was such heresy among us at the time that I protested at once. Nothing Lawrence could say or explain could wash our Bête noire, Blanche, or even jaune, for that matter, and I would have nothing of it. "The troops do not call him Rotang for nothing," I had reminded him severely. "Rotang is the Malay word for the kind of cane Hara was seldom without. The troops christened him that because he would at times, seemingly without cause, beat them over the head and face with it." "He can't help himself," John Lawrence had said. "It's not he, but an act of the Japanese gods in him, don't you see? You remember what the moon does to him?" And I, indeed, remembered. The attraction, both the keen conscious and the deep, submerged attraction that all the Japanese feel for the moon, seemed to come to a point in Hara. If ever there was a moon-swung, moon-haunted, moon-drawn soul, it was he. As the moon waxed, and how it waxed in the soft velvet sky of Insulinda, how it grew and seemed to swell to double its normal gold in mystically burning proportions, in that soft, elastic air, how it swung calmly over the great volcanic valleys like a sacred lamp, while the ground mist mingling with all the smell of cloves, cinnamon, and all the fragrant spices of Insulinda, drifted among the soaring tree trunks like incense round the lacquered columns of a sequined temple. Yes! As this unbelievable moon expanded and spread its gold among the blacknesses of our jungle night, we saw it draw a far tide of mythological frenzy to the full in Hara's blood. 7 days, 3 days before, and 3 days after, and on the day of the full moon itself, were always our days of greatest danger with Hara. Most of his worst beatings and all his killings took place then. But once the beating was over and the moon waning, he would be, for him, extraordinarily generous to us. It was as if the beating and killing had purged him of impurities of spirit, of madness and evil in some strange way, and made him grateful to them. In fact, the morning after he had cut off the head of one of us, I remembered seeing him talking to Lawrence and being struck by the fact that he had an expression of purified, of youthful, and almost spring-like innocence on his face, as if the sacrifice of the life of an innocent British aircraftman the night before had redeemed him from all original as well as private and personal sin, and appeased for the time the hungry bat-like gods of his race. All this passed through my mind like a dream with the speed and color of a dream, and it was almost as a man half asleep that I heard Lawrence continue, "Yes, it's curious that you two should think of him just then, for I have an anniversary of Hara in me today, that I'm not allowed to forget, try as I may. Have I ever told you?" He had not, and eager to consolidate any contact between us, even this precious precarious bridge, I said quickly, "No, please tell me." "Well, it was exactly 7 years ago," he said. 7 years within an hour or so, allowing for differences of Insulinda and Greenwich meantime. He was lying in a dream beyond the deep, raw physical pain in his bruised and outraged body, when, far away, like a bird perched on the daylight rim of a deep well into which he might have been thrown, he heard the first cheechak call. Yes, that was it. A cheechak. One of those agile, translucent little lizards that lived in every hut, house, and even deepest dungeons in Insulinda. There were 2 of them in his cell, and he loved them dearly. They had shared his solitary confinement from the beginning, and in his affection for them, he fancied he could tell them apart, the male from the female, just by the sounds of their voices. They were the only living things not Japanese or Korean, not an active, aggressive enemy that he had seen for so many weeks. So real had they become to him that he christened them Patrick and Patricia. He knew instantly when he heard the sound that the sound came from Patricia, and at once he was out of the dream that had consoled and drugged his pain, and back on the damp stone floor with his bruised, stiff, aching, and tired body, so tired that it could hardly take note even of the dismay which clutched at his heart the moment Patricia called. For she called like that only when it was well and truly dark, only when the jungle outside had closed its ranks and fallen back on its own black shadows between the purple volcanoes, the better to withstand that sheer, utter obliteration of outline and shape brought about by the overwhelming invasion of moonless tropical nights in the valley outside. It was as if then Patricia herself was afraid and wanted Patrick quickly to rejoin and reassure her that this great black nothingness abolished only the vision of the nearness of her mate, and not the nearness itself. "There!" Patrick had answered her, and Lawrence knew his fear was justified. For this was the hour at which the Japanese usually came for him. This was the time of night when they usually did their torturing. Yes, the details of it were not important, he said, but for weeks they had been torturing him, and the interesting thing was they always did it at night. I might smile and think him fanciful as I did about his belief that Hara was an embodiment of a myth more than a conscious individual being, even though I had seen for myself how moon-swung Hara and his countrymen were. But that was by no means all there was to it. That was only the elementary beginning of it all. The more complete truth was, they were all still deeply submerged like animals, insects, and plants in the succession of the hours, the movement of day into night, and the days into their lunar months, and the months into their seasons. They were subject to cosmic rhythm and movement and ruled by cosmic forces beyond their control to an extent undreamt of in the European mind and philosophy. He would have more to say of that presently, but all he had to stress at the moment was this. It was only at night that people so submerged in the raw elements of nature could discover sufficiently with sun and sunlight into that deep, deep pit of blackness and time in themselves, to the bottom of their own unlit natures, where torture was not only natural, but inevitable, like the tides of the sea. I may not recognize it, he said, but Patricia and Patrick knew in the nerves and very swish of their tidal tails that a moment of great and ancient dread in the movement of the spheres had come, and hardly had they called, when he heard the jackbooted steps, untidy and slurred as if the boots were mounted on an orangutan and not a man, coming down the corridor toward his cell. Our Father, who art in heaven, his lips moved instinctively. Once more, please, be thou my shepherd. As he said this prayer for the third time to himself, the door was unlocked and a Korean guard called out, in a mixture of the crudest Japanese and Malay, and in the most arrogant and insolent tone, "Kura! User! Come here! Rakas! Quick!" He got up slowly. He could not in his condition do otherwise, but it was too slow for the guard, who jumped into the cell, pulled Lawrence angrily to his feet, and pushed him out into the corridor, prodding him again with the butt of his rifle and saying again and again, "Lakas! Lakas!" and "Quick! Quick!" as well as making other strange, irritated abdominal noises at him. In a few minutes he was marched into the commandant's office, and there, sitting at the commandant's desk, was not that girlish young subaltern, but Hara himself, with a section of the guard, hat in hand and rifles at the side, standing respectfully behind him. Lawrence, his eyes hurting as if stung by bees in that fierce electric light, looked round the room for the rest of the Inquisition, as he called them, that expert band from the Kempeitai, the headquarters of the secret police, who did the real torturing, but there was not a sign of any of them. For the first time, a feeling of hope so keen and unnerving that his conscious mind would not allow it, assailed him fiercely. True, Hara was one of the band, but not the worst. He joined in too, but only when that deep sense of an almost mystical necessity to participate in all that a group or herd of his countrymen did forced him to identify himself with what was going on. It was as if they all were incapable of experiencing anything individually, as if a thought or deed in one was instantly contagion to the rest, and the fated plague of cruel doing, like a black or yellow death, killed their individual resistance in an instant. Hara, after all, was the Japanese of the Japanese among them, and he too would have to join in the torturing. But he never started it, and Lawrence knew somehow that he would have preferred killing outright to torture. With all this in his mind, he looked at Hara more closely, and noticed that his eyes were unusually bright and his cheeks flushed. He's been drinking, he thought, for there was no mistaking in Hara's cheeks the telltale pink that drink brings so easily to the Japanese face. And that accounts for the glitter in his eye. I'd better watch out. He was right about the flush in Hara's cheeks, but wrong about the light in his eye. For suddenly Hara said, with a curl of the lip that might have been a smile struggled at birth, "Lawrence-san, do you know Father Christmas?" The unexpected use of the polite "san" to his name so nearly unnerved Lawrence that he could hardly concentrate on the mysterious "Father Christmas" in Hara's question, until he saw the clouds of incomprehension at his slowness, which usually precluded frenzy, gathering over Hara's impatient brow. Then he got it. "Yes, Hara-san," he said slowly. "I know of Father Christmas." "Hetto!" Hara exclaimed, hissing with polite gratification between his teeth, a gleam of gold sparkling for a moment between his long lips. Then, sitting far back in his chair, he announced, "Tonight, I am Father Christmas." 3 or 4 times he made this astonishing statement, roaring with laughter. Lawrence joined in politely without any idea what it really meant. He had been lying there in his cell alone, under sentence of death, for so long that he hardly knew the hour of the night beyond the fact that it was a normal torture hour, and he had no idea of the date or month. He certainly had no idea that it was Christmas. Hara enjoyed his announcement and Lawrence's obvious perplexity so much that he would have gone on prolonging his moment of privileged and one-sided merriment had not a guard presented himself at that moment in the doorway and ushered in a tall, bearded Englishman in the faded uniform of a group captain in the RAF. Hara stopped up laughing instantly. An expression of reverse, almost of hostility, came over his features at the sight of Hixley Ellis's elongated frame in the doorway. I could see Hara clearly, as Lawrence spoke, could see him stiffen at the RAF officer's entrance. For all of us, he hated the tall, lisping Hixley Ellis, I think, by far the most. "This Air Force colonel," he told Lawrence in Japanese, waving his hand disdainfully at the group captain, "is commander of the prisoners in my camp. You can go with him now." Lawrence hesitated, not believing his ears, and Hara, confirmed in his own sense of the magnanimity of his gesture by the unwilled expression of belief on Lawrence's face, sat back and laughed all the more. Seeing him laugh like that again, Lawrence at last believed him and walked over to join the group captain. Together, without a word, they started to go, but as they got to the door, Hara in his fiercest parade voice called out, "Lawrence!" Lawrence turned round with a resigned despair. He might have known that this transition was too sudden, too good to be true. This was but part of the torture. Some psychologist among the secret police must have put the simple Hara up to it. But one look at Hara's face reassured him. He was still beaming benevolently. A strange twisted smile between a quick curling lip and yellow teeth framed in gold on his twilight face. With an immense hissing effort, as he caught Lawrence's eyes, he called out, "Lawrence! Merry Christmas!" Merry and Vaze Christmas were the only English words Lawrence ever heard him use, and he believed Hara knew no others. Hara went pinker still with the effort of getting them out, before he relaxed, purring almost like a cat in the commandant's chair. "But he knew something about Christmas all the same," I interrupted Lawrence. "It was most extraordinary, you know. When the Padre Hixley Ellis and I thought of organizing some celebration of our first Christmas in jail, we never thought for a moment a thug like Hara would allow it. But the curious thing was, when we asked him, he exclaimed at once. So our interpreter said, 'The feast of Father Christmas!' When the interpreter answered yes, Hara agreed at once. No argument or special plea was needed. He said yes firmly, and his orders went out accordingly. In fact, he was himself so taken by the idea that he went to the other camps, and were also in his officer's command, camps with non-Christian Chinese, animistic Menadonese, and Muslim Javanese in them, and forced them all to celebrate Christmas, whether they liked it or not. The interpreter told us, in fact, that Hara even eat up the Chinese commandant. When Hara asked him who Father Christmas was, the unsuspecting man quite truthfully said he had no idea. Whereupon Hara called him a liar, a crime in his code equal to wrong thinking and willfulness. Said all the world knew who Father Christmas was, and at once flew into one of his frenzies. It was odd, very odd, the value he attached to Christmas. We never found out where he got it from, did you? I'm afraid not, Lawrence answered, but odder still, it saved my life. You never told us, I exclaimed, amazed. No, I did not, for I didn't know it myself at the time, though I expected it, of course, for my own sins. But I saw my papers after the war, and they were actually going to kill me on December 22nd. But your putting the idea of Christmas into Hara's head saved me. He substituted a Chinaman for me and let me out as a gesture to Father Christmas. But to continue, he had followed Hixley Ellis out of Hara's office and joined up with me again in the common prison. Suddenly he smiled at me, a gentle, reminiscent, and tenderly grateful smile, as the relief of his release came back to him. Did I remember the moment? He could not but be amused in his recollection, for although we were all incarcerated in a Dutch colonial jail for murderers and desperate criminals, so relative had our concept of freedom become that we rushed up to him and congratulated him on his liberation, without a trace on our part or a suspicion of his, of the irony implicit in it. Then not long afterwards, Hara suddenly left us. He was put in charge of a draft of RAF officers and men under Hixley Ellis and sent to build aerodromes in the outer islands. We did not see him again until near the end, when he returned with only 1/5 of the original draft left alive. Our men looked like ghosts or drought-stricken cattle when they arrived back. We could see their shoulder blades and ribs through their threadbare tunics. They were so weak that we had to carry most of them in stretchers from the cattle trucks wherein they had traveled, trucks which stank of urine and diseased excretions. For not only were they so starved that just a faint pulse of life fluttering with a rapidly regressive spirit was left in them, but also they all had either dysentery, malignant malaria, or both. 1/5 was all that remained, the rest were dead, and Hixley Ellis had terrible things to tell of their treatment by the Japanese officers and NCOs and their Korean underlings, and above all, about Hara. Again, Hara was at the center, the primordial Japanese core of this weird inspiration of distorted circumstances. It was he who was again de facto, if not de jure, ruler of their world. He who beat dying men, saying there was nothing wrong with them except their spirit, their evil thinking, their wayward willfulness of heart, which made them deliberately ill in order to retard the Japanese war effort. It was he, Hara, who cut off the heads of 3 aircraft men, because they had crept through a fence at night to buy food in a village, and after each head rolled on the ground, brought his sword to his lips, thanking it for having done its work so cleanly. It was he who, day after day, in the tropical sun, drove a horde of men ailing and only half alive to scrape an aerodrome out of coral rock, with inadequate tools until they were dying and being thrown to the sharks in the sea at a rate of 20 or 30 a day. But Hara himself appeared untouched by his experience, as if he had foreseen and pre-suffered it all in his mother's womb, as if life could neither add to nor diminish the stark wine in his legendary cup. He came back to us burnt black by the sun, that was all. For the rest, he naturally took up the steely thread of command, where he left it as if he had never been away, and drove us again with the same iron hand. Even at the end, when the prison was full of rumors and the treacherous, unstable Korean guards, scenting a change in the wind of time, were beginning to fawn and make up to our men for past misdeeds, were even whining to them about their own suppression under the Japanese, when the ground under the feet of Hara's warlords was cracking and reverberating from the shock of the explosions at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and when the legendary twilight of the submerged racial soul of Japan must have been dark and sagging under the weight of the wings of dragons coming home to roost. Hara never trembled nor wavered once. He must have known as well as anybody what was going on, but in that tide of rumor and wild emotion running free before the wind of change, he stood like a rock. Only 3 days before the end, there was a terrible scene with Lawrence. Lawrence had found a Korean sentry, one of the worst, prodding a dying man with his bayonet, trying to make the aircraftmen stand up to salute him. Lawrence had seized the sentry's rifle with both hands, pushed the bayonet aside, and forced himself between the sentry and the sick man. He was immediately marched off to the guard-room, arriving there just as Hara returned from a tour of inspection. The sentry told Hara what had happened, and Hara, much as he liked Lawrence, would not overlook this insult to the arms of his country. He beat up Lawrence with his cane over the face and head so thoroughly that I hardly recognized him when he joined us again. 3 days later, the end came, and we all went our inevitable ways. Lawrence did not see Hara again for nearly 2 years. When he saw Hara, then, it was in the dock at his trial. Yes, hadn't I heard? Hara was sought out and brought to trial before one of our war crime tribunals. It was largely Hixley Ellis's doing, of course. I could have no idea how bitter that mild, lisping, sensitive fellow had become. It was understandable, of course, after what he had suffered, that he should be truly, implacably, and irretrievably bitter and vengeful, and he gave his evidence at the trial with such a malign relish and fury that Hara never had a hope of a mitigated sentence, let alone acquittal. But what was not so understandable was the bitterness of the official prosecution, for bitter as Hixley Ellis was, his temper was more than matched by that of the war crime sleuths. And that, Lawrence exclaimed, incomprehension on his broad brow, was very odd to me. After all, none of them had suffered under the Japanese. As far as I know, none of the particular bunch on Hara's trail had even been on active service. but they were nonetheless a bloodthirsty lot. They were more vengeful on behalf of our injuries than I myself could ever be. He said all this in such a way that I gathered he had tried to plead for Hara and failed. It certainly seemed highly significant to me that when Lawrence held his hand out after the trial to say goodbye, Hixley Ellis had refused to take it and silently turned a neat, tense Air Force back on him. I could not resist asking, therefore, "Did you tell the court that Hara saved your life?" "Indeed I did," he replied, surprised that I should have found the question necessary. "I did that, and the judge advocate looked me up and down over a pair of the most unmilitary glasses, and said in a slow, precise voice, each syllable as distinct and pointed as a letter pinpricked on a blank sheet of paper, a trace of ponderous irony for which I can't blame him in his voice, 'That, of course, Colonel Lawrence, is a valuable consideration, most valuable, indeed hardly less valuable to this court than it must be to you. But it must not be overlooked that there are many others for whom life would have been no less valuable, who are not here today as a direct result of the accused actions.' No, there was obviously nothing to be done. Hara was inevitably condemned to be hanged. How did he take it? I asked, with the memory of the way others had marched to the fall of Hara's keen two-headed sword on the backs of their necks as fresh in my mind, as if it were a picture painted that morning. "Without a tremor or change of expression, as you would have expected," Lawrence said. "After all, he had pleaded guilty from the start, said, as that hopeless inadequate interpreter told the court, 'I am wrong for my people and ready to die.' He made no effort to defend himself, except to say that he tried never to do more nor less than his duty. He called no witnesses, asked no questions even of me, and just went on standing silently and rigidly to attention in the box right to the end. Besides, all that, too, had been foreseen." "Foreseen?" I asked, surprised. "Yes," he explained. "Hara had never expected anything except death of some kind in the war. In fact, in an unconscious way, perhaps he had even longed for death. I must please not be too skeptical, but try and follow what he was trying to say with intuition rather than with conscious understanding. This was the other half of what he'd been trying to say in the beginning. It was most important, most relevant, and the one foundation whereon his understanding either stood erect or fell. He'd always felt, even when he was in Japan, that the Japanese were a people in a profound inverse, reverse, or if I preferred it, even perverse sense, more in love with death than living. As a nation, they romanticized death and self-destruction as no other people. The romantic fulfillment of the national ideal, of the heroic thug of tradition, was often a noble and stylized self-destruction in a selfless cause. It was as if the individual at the start, at birth even, rejected his own claim of his own individuality. Henceforth he was inspired not by individual human precept and example so much as by his own inborn sense of the behavior of the corpuscles in his own blood, dying every split second in millions in defense of the corporate whole. As a result, they were socially not unlike a more complex extension of the great insect societies in life. In fact, in the days when he lived in Japan, much as he liked the people in the country, his mind always returned involuntarily to this basic comparison. The just parallel was not an animal one, was not even the most tight and fanatical horde, but an insect one. Collectively, they were a sort of super society of bees with the emperor as a male queen bee at the center. He did not want to exaggerate these things, but he knew of no other way of making me realize how strangely, almost cosmically, propelled like an eccentric and dying comet on an archaic, anti-clockwise and foredoomed course, Hara's people had been. They were so committed, blindly and mindlessly entangled in their real and imagined past, their view of life was not synchronized to our urgent time. Above all, they could not respond to the desperate 20th century call for greater and more precise individual differentiation. Their view of life refused to be individual, and to rise above their own volcanic and quaking earth, as if there was always a dark glass or the shadow of the great dragon's wings of their submerged selves beneath them, in the light of individual mind, a long blackness of their own spinning globe between them and the sun, darkening the moon for which they yearned so eagerly, and some of the finest stars. He was sorry it sounded fantastic, but he could put it no other way. Unless... He paused and looked at the simple spire of the village church just appearing in a dip at the fold of the field in front of us, as if its precise and purposeful shape presiding so confidently over the trusting and sleeping land, rebuked the shapeless, unformed, and dim-lit region wherein his imagination moved so like a lone sleepwalker at midnight. Thereupon he broke off the apparent continuity of his thought at once and asked me if I knew how the Japanese calculated the age of an individual. I said, no, and he explained that at birth they added 9 months to a person's life, counted in all the days between his conception and emergence from the womb. Didn't I see the significance of that? Didn't I realize that such a system of reckoning life was not just an artless and naive accident of minds more primitive than ours? If I pause to reflect how biology clearly establishes that we recapture and relive in the womb the whole evolution of life, from amoeba to Pithecanthropus Erectus, surely I too would recognize implicit in this system of reckoning a clear instinctive acknowledgement of the importance of the dim past to the Japanese character. He certainly looked at it that way, and until now he had been forced to think of them as a people whose spiritual and mental umbilical cord with the past was uncut, a people still tied by the navel to the mythical mother and begetter of their race, the great sun goddess Amaterasu. Even in that they were characteristically perverse, reverse, and inside out, for to most races the sun was a bright and shining masculine deity, but to them only a great, darkly glittering mother, while the moon, so beloved and eternally feminine to the rest of mankind, was male and masculine to them. Perhaps it was that inside-out, upside-down subjection to the past which gave them their love of death. If I had ever attended a feast of the dead in Japan, as he had often done, I would not be surprised at his use of so strange a word as to illustrate his meaning. That feast was the gayest and most cheerful of all Japanese celebrations. Their dead were happy, cheerful, contented, and benevolent spirits. Why? Because the living, one felt, really preferred dying to living, as they had to live, not only preferred it, but also thought it nobler to die than to live for their country. Not life, but death was romantic to them, and Hara was no exception. He had all this and more, deeply ingrained in him, underneath and beyond conscious thinking. He had more, because above all he was a humble, simple, and believing country fellow as well. I shall never forget one night in prison, Lawrence continued, picking up yet another thread of our prison yesterdays, and weaving it as if it were something new and freshly made into this pattern of Hara in his mind, until my heart was heavy that so much should remain for him apparently immune to time. Hara sent for me. He had been drinking and greeted me uproariously, but I knew his merriment was faked. He always behaved like that when his heart and mind were threatening to join in revolt against his long years of exile from Japan. I could see that the drink had failed to blur the keen edge of nostalgia that was like a knife stab in the pit of his stomach. He wanted someone to talk to about his country, and for some hours I walked Japan from end to end with him, through all 4 of its unique and dramatic seasons. The mask of cheerfulness got more and more dramatic. The mask of cheerfulness got more and more threadbare as the evening wore on, and at last Hara tore it from his face.
"Why, Lawrence?"
he exclaimed fiercely at last.
"Why are you alive? I would like you better if you were dead. How could an officer of your rank ever have allowed himself to fall alive in our hands? How can you bear the disgrace? Why don't you kill yourself?"
Yes, he asked me that too once, I interrupted, more with the object of letting Lawrence know how closely I was following him, than of telling him something he didn't know. In fact, he taunted us all so much that, in time, the Koreans picked up the habit too, but what did you say in reply? I admitted the disgrace, if you wish to call it that, Lawrence replied, but said that in our view disgrace, like danger, was something which also had to be bravely borne and lived through, and not run away from by a cowardly taking of one's own life. This was so novel and unexpected a point of view to him that he was tempted to dismiss it as false, and made himself say, No, it is fear of dying that stops you all." He spat disdainfully on the floor, and tapping on his chest with great emphasis added,
"I am already dead. Hara, died many years ago."
And then it came out, of course. The night before he left home to join the army at the age of 17, that is, after 9 months in the womb and 16 years and 3 months on Earth, He had gone to a little shrine in the hills nearby to say goodbye to life, to tell the spirits of his ancestors that he was dying that day in his heart and spirit for his country, so that when death came to claim him in battle, it would be a mere technicality, so that far from being surprised, he would greet it either like a bosom friend, long expected and overdue, or merely accept it as a formal confirmation of a state which had long existed. To hear him, one would have thought that this bow-legged boy, with his blue-shaven head, yellow face, and shuffling walk, had gone to report to his ancestors his decision to enter one of the grimmer monastic orders, like the Grande Chartreuse, rather than to announce his banal intention of joining a regiment of infantry. But you see what I mean when I say the end, too, had been foreseen? I nodded silently, too interested to want to speak, and Lawrence went steadily on. Even that evening in prison, Lawrence was conscious of a content, a sort of extraterritorial meaning, to the moment that did not properly belong to it. It was as if Hara's end was drinking his wine with him, as if far down at some inexpressible depth in their minds the ultimate sentence was already pronounced. Looking back now, he found it most significant that, toward the end of that evening, Hara began to try his hand at composing verses in that tight, brief, and extremely formal convention in which the popular hero of the past in Japan inevitably said farewell to the world before taking his own life. He remembered Hara's final effort well. Roughly translated, it ran,
When I was 17, looking over the pines at Kurashiyama, I saw on the full yellow moon the shadow of wild geese flying south. There is no shadow of wild geese returning on the moon rising over Kurashiyama tonight.
Poor devil, as I watched and listened to him trying to break into the verse. And suddenly I saw our roles reversed. I saw, as if by a flash of lightning in the darkness of my own mind, that I was really the free man, and Hara, my jailer, the prisoner. I had once in my youth, in those ample unexacting days before the war, when the coining of an epigram had looked so convincingly like a discovery of wisdom, defined individual freedom to myself as freedom to choose one's own cage in life. Hara had never known even that limited freedom. He was born in a cage, a prisoner in an oubliette of mythology, chained to bars welded by a great blacksmith of the ancient gods themselves, and I felt an immense pity for him. And now 4 years later, Hara was our kind of prisoner as well, and in the dock for the last time, with sentence of death irrevocably pronounced. So unsurprised, so unperturbed was Hara, Lawrence said, that as his escort snapped the handcuffs on him and ordered him to step down to his cell below, he stopped on the edge of the concealed stair, turned round with the utmost self-composure, sought out Lawrence and Hixley Ellis, who were sitting side by side next to the prosecuting officer. When his eyes met theirs, he raised his manacled hands above his head, clasped them together like a boxer who had just won the world championship, and waved gaily to the two of them, grinning a golden smile from ear to ear as he did so. How clearly I saw him do it! That gesture was all of a piece with the character also as I knew it. For whatever it was that held Hara together, I too knew that he could never fail it. Suddenly I was glad, almost grateful to him, that he had taken it like that, gone from our view with a gay, triumphant gesture of farewell, for somehow, I imagined, that would make it easier for us now to have done with his memory. So that was how he went, I remarked, not without a certain unwilled relief. That then was Hara's, that. No, not at all, Lawrence said, quickly, a strange new ring in his voice, a passionate and surprising emotional undertone for so calm and contemplative a person. That by no means was his that. As far as I'm concerned, that was only the end of the beginning of the that. It came out then that the night before he was hanged, Hara got a message through, begging Lawrence to come and see him. Hara had made the request, his last, many days before, but it was not surprising to anyone who knew the usual official channels, as well as we did, that the request did not reach Lawrence until 10 o'clock on the night before, or the morning set for his execution. Lawrence got his car out as fast as he could, his chivalrous nature outraged by the thought that the condemned man would now most certainly have given up all hope of seeing him, and be preparing to die with the bitter conviction that even his last slight request had been too much. Hara's prison was on the far side of the island, and he could not, with the best of luck, get there before midnight. The evening was very still and quiet, rather as if it had caught his own breath at the beauty and brilliance of the night that was marching down on it out of the east, like a goddess with jewels of fire. An immense full moon had swung itself clear over the dark fringe of the jungle bound, like a ceremonial fringe of ostrich plumes designed for an ancient barbaric ritual, to the dark brow of the land ahead. In that responsive and plastic tropical air, the moon seemed magnified to twice its normal size, and to be quicksilver wet and dripping with its own light. To the north of the jungle, and all along its heavy feathered fringes, the sea rolled and unrolled its silver and gold cloak onto the white and sparkling sand, as lightly and deftly as a fine old Far Eastern merchant unrolling bales of his choicest silk. The ancient patient swish of it all was constantly in Lawrence's ears, but out on the horizon, the sea, too, went dark, seemed shrunk into a close defensive ring, in face of the thunder and lightning hurled against it by curled, curved, and jagged peaks of cloud, which stood revealed on the uttermost edge by the intermittent electric glow imperative in purple and sullen in gold. It was the sort of night and the kind of setting in a halfway moment between the end of one's day and the beginning of the other, in which Lawrence's articulate knowledge seemed to hold the same urgent, spasmodic, and intermittent qualities, the electricity and lightning quivering along the horizon. Yet his inarticulate, inexpressible awareness of the abiding meaning, beauty, and richness of life was as great as the vast, eager-footed, and passionate night, striding overhead like a queen to a meeting with a royal lover. All that we had been through, the war, the torture, the long hunger, all the grim and tranced years in our sordid prison, he found light and insignificant weight in the golden scales of that moment. The thought that yet another life should be sacrificed to our discredited and insufficient past seemed particularly pointless and repugnant, and filled him with a sense of angry rebellion. In this mood and manner he arrived at the prison just before midnight. He found he was expected and was taken at once to Hara's cell. Like all condemned persons, Hara was alone in the cell. When the door opened to let Lawrence in, although there was a chair at hand, Hara was standing by the window, his face close to the bars, looking at the moonlight so vivid and intense by contrast to the darkness inside, that it was like a sheet of silver silk nailed to the square window. He had obviously given up all idea of visitors and was expecting at most only a routine call from one of his jailers. He made no effort to turn round or speak. But as the guard switched on the light, he turned to make a gesture of protest, and saw Lawrence. He stiffened as if hit by a heavy blow to the back, came to attention and bowed silently and deeply to his visitor, in a manner which told Lawrence that he was moved beyond words. As he bowed, Lawrence saw that his head had been freshly shaven, and that the new scraped skin shone like satin in the electric light. Lawrence ordered the sentry to leave them for a while, and as the door once more closed, he said to Hara, who was coming out of his low bow, "I am very sorry I am so late, but I only got your message at 9 o'clock. I expect you gave me up as a bad job long ago and thought I'd refuse to come."
"No, Lawrence-san," Hara answered. "No, not that. I never thought you would refuse to come, but I was afraid my message, for many reasons, might not be delivered to you. I am very grateful for you for coming, and I apologize for troubling you. I would not done so if it hadn't been so important. Forgive me, please, but there is something wrong in my thinking, and I know you would understand how hard it would be for me to die with wrong thoughts in my head."
Hara spoke slowly and deliberately in a polite, even voice, but Lawrence could tell from its very evenness that his thought was flowing in a deep, fast stream out to sea, flowing in a deeper chasm of himself than it had ever flowed before. Poor devil, bloody poor devil, he thought. Even now the problem is thinking, always his own or other people's thinking is at fault. "There is nothing to forgive, Hara-san," he said aloud. "I came at once and when I got your message, and I came gladly. Please tell me what it is, and I'll try to help you." From the way Hara's dark, slanted, child-of-a-sun goddess's eyes lit up at the use of the polite "san" to his name, Lawrence knew that Hara had not been spoken to in that manner for many months.
Lawrence-san,
he answered eagerly, pleading more like a boy with his teacher than a war-scarred sergeant major with an enemy and an officer.
it is only this. I've always understood us Japanese. Even when I have had to punish you, I felt you understood it was not I, Hara, who wanted it, but that it had to be, and you never hated me for it. Please tell me now. You English, I have always been told, are fair and just people. Whatever other faults we all think you have, we have always looked upon you as a just people. You know I am not afraid to die. You know that after what has happened to my country, I shall be glad to die tomorrow. Look, I have shaved the hair off my head. I have taken a bath of purification, rinsed my mouth and throat, washed my hands and drunk the rest cupful of water for the long journey. I have emptied the world from my head, washed it off my body, and am ready for my body to die, as I have died in my mind long since. Truly, you must know, I do not mind dying, only why I must die for the reason you give. I don't know what I have done wrong that other soldiers who are not to die have not done. We have all killed one another, and I know it is not good, but it is war. I have punished you and killed your people, but I punished you no more and killed no more than I would have done if you were Japanese in my charge who had behaved in the same way. I was kinder to you, in fact, than I would have been to my own people, kinder to you or than many others. I was more lenient, believe or not, than army rules and rulers demanded. If I had not been so severe and strict, you would all have collapsed in your spirit and died, because your way of thinking was so wrong and your disgrace so great. If it were not for me, Hickory Ellis and all his men would have died on the island out of the despair. It was not my fault that the ships with food and medicine did not come. I could only beat my prisoners alive and save those that had it in them to live by beating them to greater effort. And now I am being killed for it. I do not understand where I went wrong except in the general wrong of us all. If I did another wrong, please tell me how and why I shall die happy.
I didn't know what to say. Lawrence turned to me with a gesture of despair. He was only asking me what I had asked myself ever since these damn war trials began. I honestly didn't understand myself. I never saw the good of them. It seemed to me just as wrong for us now to condemn Hara under a law which had never been his, of which he had never even heard, as he and his masters had been to punish and kill us for transgressions of the code of Japan that was not ours. It was not as if he had sinned against his own lights. If ever a person had been true to himself and the twilight glimmer in him, it was this terrible little man. He may have done wrong for the right reasons, but how could it be squared by us now doing right in the wrong way? No punishment I could think of could restore the past, could be more futile and more calculated even to give the discredited past a new lease of life in the present than this sort of uncomprehending and uncomprehended vengeance. I didn't know what the hell to say. The distress over his predicament became so poignant in this recollection that he broke off with a wave of his hand at the darkening sky. "But you did say something, surely," I said. "You could not leave it at that." "Oh yes, I said something," he said sadly, "but it was most inadequate. All I could tell him was that I did not understand myself, and that if I lay with me, I would gladly let him out and send him straight back to his family." "And did that satisfy him?" I asked. Lawrence shook his head. He didn't think so, for after bowing deeply again and thanking Lawrence, he looked up and asked, "So, what am I to do?" Lawrence could only say, "You can try to think only with your heart, Hara-san, that unfair and unjust as this thing which my people are doing seems to you, that it is done only to try and stop the kind of things that happened between us in the war from ever happening again. You can say to yourself, as I used to say to my despairing men in prison under you, there is a way of winning by losing, a way of victory and defeat, which we are going to discover. Perhaps that too must be your way to understanding and victory now.
That, Lorenzo-san, he said, with the quick intake of breath of a Japanese when truly moved, is a very Japanese thought.
They stood in silence for a long while, looking each other straight in the eyes, the English officer and the Japanese NCO. The moonlight outside was tense, its silver strands trembling faintly with the reverberation of inaudible and far-off thunder, and the crackle of the electricity of lightning along the invisible horizon. Hara was the first to speak. In that unpredictable way of his, he suddenly smiled, and said irrelevantly,
I gave you a good Christmas once, didn't I?
Indeed you did, Lawrence answered, unhappily, adding instinctively, You gave me a very, very good Christmas. Please take that thought with you tonight.
Can I take it with me all the way? Hara asked, still smiling, but with something almost gaily provocative in his voice. Is it good enough to go even where I am going?
Yes, much as circumstances seem to belie it, Lawrence answered. It is good enough to take all the way and beyond. At that moment, the guard announced himself and told Lawrence he had already overstayed his time. Sayonara, Hara-san, Lawrence said, bowing deeply, using that ancient farewell of the Japanese. If so, it must be, which is filled with the sense of their incalculable and inexorable fate. Sayonara, and God go with you.
If so, it must be, Hara said calmly, bowing as deeply. If so, it must be, and thank you for your great kindness, and your good coming, and above all, your honorable words.
Lawrence stood up quickly, not trusting his self-control enough to look at Hara again, and started to go, but as he came to the doorway, Hara called out,
Lawrence!
Just as he had once called it in the commandant's office after Lawrence's weeks of torture. Lawrence turned, and there was Hara grinning widely, faded yellow teeth and gold rims plainly showing as if he had never enjoyed himself more. As Lawrence's eyes met his, he called out gaily, Merry Christmas, Lawrence-san! But the eyes, Lawrence said, were not laughing. There was a light in them of a moment which transcends lesser moments, wherein all earthly and spiritual conflicts tend to be resolved, and unimportant, all partiality and incompletion gone, and only a deep somber between night and morning glow left. It transformed Hara's strange distorted features. The rather anthropoidal prehistoric face of Hara's looked more beautiful than any Lawrence had ever seen. He was so moved by it and by the expression in those archaic eyes that he wanted to turn back into the cell. Indeed, he tried to go back, but something would not help him. Half of himself, a deep, instinctive, natural, impulsive half, wanted to go back, clasp Hara in the arms, and kiss him goodbye on his forehead and say, We may not be able to stop and undo the hard old wrongs of the great world outside, but through you and me no evil shall come, either in the unknown where you are going, or in this imperfect and haunted dimension of awareness through which I move. Thus, between us, we shall cancel out all private and personal evil, thus arrest private and personal consequences to blind action and reaction, thus prevent specifically the general incomprehension, misunderstanding, hatred, and revenge of our time from spreading further. But the words would not be uttered, and half of him, the conscious half of the officer at the door with a critical, alert sentry at his side, held him powerless on the threshold. So for the last time the door shut on Hara and his golden grin. But all the way back to town, that last expression on Hara's face traveled at Lawrence's side. He was filled with great regret that he had not gone back. What was this ignoble half that had stopped him? If only he had gone back, he felt now he might have changed the whole course of history. For was not that how great things began in the tiny seed of the small change in the troubled individual heart? One single, lonely, inexperienced heart had to change first, and all the rest would follow. One true change in one humble, obedient, and contrite individual heart, humble enough to accept without intellectual question the first faint stirring of the natural spirit seeking flesh and blood to express it, humble enough to live the new meaning before thinking it, and one more archaic cycle it, and all the rest would have followed as the day and night, and one more archaic cycle of hurt avenged, and vengeance revenge would have been cut forever. He felt he had failed the future, and his heart went so dim and black on him that abruptly he pulled up the car by a palm grove on the edge of the sea. Sadly, he listened to the ancient sound of the water lapping at the sands, and the rustle of the wind of morning in the palms overhead traveling the spring world and night sky like the endless quieting spirit of God tracking its brief and imperfect container in man. He saw some junks go out to sea, and the full moon come sinking down, fulfilled and weary, onto their black corrugated sails. The moon was now even larger than when he had first seen it. Yes, now Hara's last moon was not only full, but also overflowing with a yellow valedictory light. And as he was thinking, from a Malay village hidden in the jungle behind, there suddenly rang out the crow of a cock, sounding the alarm of day. The sound was more than he could bear. It sounded like notice of the first betrayal, joined to depravity of the latest, and became a parody of Hara's call of Merry Christmas. And although it was not Christmas, and the land behind was not a Christian land, he felt that he had betrayed the sum of all the Christmases. Quickly he turned the car round. He would get back to the jail, to see Hara and atone for his hesitation. He drove recklessly fast and reached the gates as the dawn, in a great uprush of passionate flaming red light, hurled itself at the prison towers above him. But of course I was too late, Lawrence told me, terribly distressed. Hara was already hanged, took his arm, and turned with him for home. I could not speak, and when he went on to ask, more of himself than of me or the darkening sky, "Must we always be too late?" He asked the question, without knowing it, also for me. It hung like the shadow of a bar of a new prison between us and the emerging stars, and my heart filled with tears.